Hey, been a little while since I've done this. I want to do a film review, but I want this to be a little bit different from usual insofar as there's a particular aspect of this film that I want to discuss. And the film is this: Cemetery Junction. This is not my intellectual property, no copyright infringement intended. Um, as always with these things, there's going to be some spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film and you don't want some key parts given away, then maybe don't watch this. Um, so the film basically, it's a British film. It's set in Reading, which is a large commuter town outside London, in the early 1970s, 1973 to be precise. And I've seen this a few times. It's been a few years now since I've watched this, and I've forgotten actually, this is a damn good movie. I call it, in my view, one of the best British films of recent years. Very underrated in the sense I think it deserves a lot more recognition. Now, when I first saw this, or I first heard about it, it was written and directed by Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant. Ricky Gervais is a well-known comedian in the UK. I've sort of mixed feelings about his humour, so I thought, Ricky Gervais, will that work? I guess I'd make an analogy here with Jim Carrey and A Christmas Carol. I thought Jim Carrey playing Scrooge, but I really enjoyed that adaptation. I really enjoyed this. So basically, it's about a group of young men growing up in Reading in the early 70s. Cemetery Junction is an actual place, so named because it is a junction at a cemetery. Um, Reading is like many London commuter towns, and no disrespect intended to the good people of Reading, but it's like Luton, it's like Milton Keynes. At least that's the impression the film gives. It's just a big grey town. Now, I've never been to Reading. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that, but that's the impression the film gives. Luton, Milton Keynes, Hemel Hempstead, Reading, Crawley. It's just a big London commuter town. So this film is about a group of young men and, well, a group of friends, young women as well, who are trying to find their ways in life. It stars Ricky Gervais in a supporting role, Christian Cook, Felicity Jones, Tom Hughes, Jack Doolan, Emily Watson, Ricky Gervais, Matthew Good, and Ralph Fiennes. So these three young guys, one of them's a little bit simple-minded. He tells inappropriate jokes at the wrong time. Christian Cook is kind of the ambitious one in a sense of the group. He is working for an insurance company. His boss is none other than Ralph Fiennes, who is a very obnoxious character in the film. His best friend, played by Tom Hughes, um, keeps talking about getting out of town, but he never really does anything to make that happen. And he has a very strained relationship with his father. And basically, they're like three young lads, typical of the 70s and in some ways typical of today as well. They're like pulling birds, getting into fights, and generally just having a laugh. But basically, Christian Cook's character is sort of the main character of the film, along with Felicity Jones, his childhood sweetheart. They're kind of friends, and they have to be friends because she is basically engaged to his co worker, who is the rising star of the company. But you see this dynamic whereby she is slowly turning into her mother, and her mother is being kind of coerced into a 1950s wife, even though it's the early 70s. You have this kind of dynamic whereby Ralph Fiennes is a very controlling, rigid, quite unpleasant man. There's no sort of domestic violence, it doesn't go that far, but it's a very controlling scenario. And basically, she wants to be a photographer. She wants to work for National Geographic or something along those lines. And it shows these young people they want to do something with their life. Unfortunately, his friend Tom Hughes is a bit of a hothead, And like I said, he has this dynamic with his father because he thinks his father's a card. He thinks his father ran away from his fight, and that's why his mother ran away. So the interesting thing here, and this is what I want to talk about. I'll talk more about the film generally in a minute, but there's a particular scene in the film. So there's a police officer, I forget who plays him now, Welsh actor, big guy. You know, he looks like he could be a doorman in a nightclub. Um, when they get up to, no good, usually because of the temper of his friend, um, it's always the same story. This cop who knows them bails them out of jail every time. But it's basically the straw that broke the camel's back. So there's one night they go out to a nightclub and they're celebrating finally deciding to get out of town. And basically, his friend, played by Tom Hughes, he's dancing with a black girl. This is the early 70s, bear in mind. So there was quite a lot of racism around at that time. And some wise guys say, hey, mate, why are you dancing with a monkey? So he initially walks away, but then you see the scenario suddenly change. He's walking away and he thinks to hell with it. He goes back and he just lays into the guy. One thing leads to another, and he ends up in a prison cell. Um, and this police officer, who's always bailing them out, except this time it's just him, his friends don't get involved, um, basically has had enough. He says, I'm sick and tired of this shit. I'm not going to bail you out anymore. And I'm not going to recreate the whole scene, but if you've seen the film, you'll know the scene I'm talking about. It's a very powerful scene. And it basically has this one on one, almost like, how can I put it? The officer basically tells him the truth about his father. He says, your father wasn't a card. He didn't run away from the fight. In fact, he was to get a baseball bat to the guy that was looking at his woman, so to speak, and he begged him to lock him up that night because he feared what he would have done. And he says, you're not a man, you're just a boy. You don't know what the real world is. We're World War II veterans. What do you know? And it's this very intense, dramatic scene, but very powerful. And he says that it was your father who really cared about you. Your mother didn't want anything to do with you. And so he doesn't go off with his friend as they discuss. He kind of goes home, and you don't see this mushy scene where he reconciles with his father. It's clever. It's not, overly sentimental. And I think that's one of the strengths of this film. It doesn't fall into cliches. So, for example, he kind of goes home, doesn't say anything, gives his father a beer, and it's a bit awkward. And you think, okay, well, they're going to have to work on that. So it's not overly sentimental. Um, and Felicity Jones, this young woman who really wants to, do something with her life, she doesn't want to be shackled by her father and her fiance, who is just going to turn into her father. She kind of makes a break for it, and her mother, finally played by Emily Watson, says, "You let her go. I'll explain later." And it's just a great finale. All in all, it's a great movie. Even their friend, the guy who's a little bit simple-minded, tells inappropriate jokes. There's a girl in the local fish shop, I guess it is, who he fancies. And he's about to tell her his sleazy joke, but he stops himself short and thinks, well, actually, she likes me. Why blow this with one of my crude jokes? And it's just a very smart film. And, Ricky Gervais maybe isn't everyone's cup of tea, but honestly, I would say to people, give this film a chance. Cemetery Junction, 2010. It was made on a budget of 1.5 million, but it really deserves more credit and recognition. And it really shows some cultural aspects of the time. I mean, Christian Cook's family are quite racist. They're quite, his dad, played by Ricky Gervais, is quite a bigot. But frankly, typical of quite a number of families in 1970s Britain. So it's a really good film. What I like about it is it isn't overly sentimentalized. It's funny. It's very funny in some scenes. For example, the simple friend, He works as a tannoy announcer in the train station, and they're always winding him up and you know playing pranks through the tannoy. And there's some genuinely funny bits in the film. There's also some sad bits. But anyway, the bit about that I want to comment on a little bit more before I round this up. Tom Hughes, the hot-headed friend. It's an interesting dynamic when he lays into this guy for insulting the girl he's dancing with. Because on one hand, you think, well, the guy's being a racist ass, and there's sort of an honourable side to Tom Hughes' character in the sense that okay, he's a hothead, he's quite reckless, and he tends to lash out before he thinks. On the other hand, he sticks up for his friends. I mean, there's a scene, for instance, where the simple-minded friend hits on a girl, and the woman's husband doesn't like it, and he kind of backs off. Oh, sorry, mate, I didn't realize. And the guy tries to push him around, and he sticks up for him. He sticks up for the girl because the guys are being racist. So I like the multi-dimensional aspect of the characters in this film. But that whole scene where he lashes out, that can be replicated in the 70s. It can be replicated today. There's a real machismo thing about men. I've been there. I've lost my temper. Um, and it can be a scary thing because there's this Hollywood ideal of, getting into a fist fight like the old westerns, and it's, you get a few bruises and that's it. But in the real world, what are the consequences of that? It could be a night in a prison cell. It could be a situation where you get into a fist fight, someone staggers back onto a busy road, they get hit by a car. I've always been wary of street fights. I think they're very reckless. I think the only time they're justified is if you're absolutely in need of defending yourself or a more vulnerable person. I mean, I I'm not going to lie. If I was with a girlfriend or someone more vulnerable and was confronted by someone, that alpha male side of me would definitely not hesitate to do what I had to do. And I'm not making myself out to be some big macho guy, not at all. But I would do what I had to do. But what this scene in the film shows is that he could have avoided this situation. I mean, okay, he's putting up with the guy making the racist comment, but the guy wasn't being violent. So it's a scenario of how do you deal with things, and that's a real challenge, particularly for men. I say particularly for men because I mean the girls get into fights too, obviously, particularly in this country. But I think it's a real test of manhood, self-control. I mean, you get it in a boxing match. That scenario, if a fighter, hits after the bell, if he lashes out in anger, he's deducted points. Lennox Lewis once said, you know, the real test is self control. It's a really interesting thing. It's just an interesting thing to look at. So anyway, I'll wrap this up. Great movie. Check it out. No copyright infringement intended.